I know it's a post-civil rights thing, so I think it's 71 is the first year you write in your paper. So why does it originate? Where does it originate from? Tell me about the history.
Yeah, and I'll kind of start by saying I think there was kind of like an easy way I could have written the article, which would have been like the Black Caucus, they're sellouts, screw them. And I mean, that would kind of be easier, but it kind of would be the less interesting way, and I think kind of the less accurate way. And so I think tracing its evolution, like where it came from, who was involved, their social, political background, and kind of how it evolved, is kind of a more interesting question. And so it is created in 1971. It really is reflection of a new period in the civil rights movement, and a new political period. So it kind of comes out of the Voting Rights Act has passed in 1965, and it actually does make a difference. I mean, all of a sudden now you have a lot of more Black people in the South voting, a lot more Black voters registered with the Democratic Party, and a lot more Black elected officials. And there was also this feeling, I mean, this kind of crisis in direction of the civil rights movement. Like, where does it go? Having achieved some of those aims, but still having these problems persist in areas of like housing and economics and education. Where does it go? I mean, you have cries for Black power on one hand, you have the traditional civil rights establishment still there, but trying to figure out where it goes. So this is kind of the electoral arm of where to go next. And there's also a new crop of leaders. Martin Luther King Jr., of course, is assassinated in 1968. Even by the early 70s, I mean, some of the Black power leaders are actually not even on the scene really anymore, or they're in another country. So this kind of congressional leadership is born. And, in 1972, you have a jump from 4 Black congressional representatives to 13 in Congress. And so a lot of the founding members of the caucus talk about at the time, like, this was kind of supposed to institutionalize the civil rights movement in the American political system and try to chart a path forward of like, where do we go next in Congress? And I think, that's kind of where it comes out of. And it's kind of this new period where there actually is a voice for Black elected officials in Congress. You can kind of say nominally that the civil rights movement has a home finally in the American electoral system. But it's coming right at a time where the kind of social democratic economic policies that were kind of undergirding the civil rights movement are starting to be withered away, and that's what they're going to be dealing with until now, basically. But I think it does originate, and the founding members themselves. I think it's kind of interesting to look at their makeup. There kind of used to be a term Marxists would use called human material. I think we should bring that term back. But it's like, where do these people come from politically? What molded them? And, contrast them with the members of the Black Congressional Black Caucus today. Largely, a lot of these people kind of came out of the movement to various degrees. Now, some of them were more.
You mean the civil rights movement?
Right. And a lot of them had a certain social democratic common sense economically. I mean, a lot of these people, they would be a dream to have around today. If you had a Black caucus or really any Congress people. I mean, there are new people. I mean, some people in the squad who have a similar politics, but like, you would look at their platform and what they were running on. And these are people, they had an insurgent quality coming out of the civil rights movement. A lot of them, were working with unions. I mean, John Conyers is a good example. His father was a United Auto Workers member. He kind of came up through the union. He got endorsed by the UAW. He had a social democratic platform. He was against the Vietnam War. So a lot of people like that to various degrees were part of the founding cohort. And they would kind of, to their credit, I mean, we can get into the criticisms, but for a long time, the Black Caucus kind of stood out as trying to defend the welfare state against Nixon and Carter and eventually Reagan.
Is that kind of how they're framed originally? Because you kind of write about that in your paper, that they are the barrier between, or trying to be the barrier between Nixon and his disintegration of what comes about in the administration before. with Lyndon, or not administrators, 2 administrations before?
Well,
Maybe there's 1 administration before, right?
Yeah, one.
Right. 1 administration before. And I guess those are would you say those are valiant goals at this moment in time to protect this welfare state?
And I think this kind of speaks to the success and legacy of like the elements like Bayard Rustin, Martin Luther King, A. Philip Randolph, who were really focused on things like full employment and those economic things. I think that really did rub off on this cohort of the early Congressional Black Caucus people. And I think they kind of correctly named that, the New Deal and then more recently, like the Great Society programs, like the fate of Black communities was very closely tied to these economic programs. And there's definitely a critique to be had about Great Society. I don't think those are on the level of the New Deal, but I think they kind of correctly saw that an attack on the Great Society is going to hurt Black people more than most. And yes, go Birds.
We'll get into that later.
Yeah, so I think it was a valiant effort, and you kind of see them. It starts with Nixon, and then Carter is like a disappointment to many people, including the Congressional Black Caucus. And they kind of become like, they even describe themselves as like the moral conscience of the Congress. So you kind of see them consistently trying to resist cuts to the welfare state. They put out platforms like whenever Nixon or Reagan would give a State of the Union, they would give a counter State of the Union. And again, we would look at this. This would kind of be a dream for the Black Caucus to be doing today. They would put out a counter platform calling for full employment, saying we need to reduce the military budget, we need to tax the rich more, we need to defend Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid. So they kind of position themselves that way. Now, after a while, they don't have any power to really defeat these things, and it kind of becomes symbolic. And they're not really able to, and I don't think you could put this only on their shoulders, but they weren't really able to galvanize a movement outside of Congress, a real kind of mass grassroots movement for these things. So it's kind of becomes part of the machinery of Congress is like, okay, you'll have the Black Caucus protesting these things, and they're going to do their thing, but they don't really have any power to stop what's coming. So I think they were noble efforts, but they obviously could not stem the tide of what came.
Now, the Congressional Black Caucus is formed in 1971 with a small amount of members. Someone asked, I don't know if they was jokingly or not in the chat, they didn't have a Congressional Black Caucus during Reconstruction. And I would no, they didn't, right?
Right.
No. Were they just happy to be there during Reconstruction, or? Well,
that's a good point. I don't know.
I think it was a different time, right?
Yeah, I think something to this might be, and I'm kind of speculating here, but the Reconstruction moment was kind of more of like a populist moment, and it was, I think, more tied into an explicitly multiracial populist movement. And I think they were thinking they could, so soon after slavery, like maybe we can just like get rid of this race idea quickly, and we won't have to have like a Black Caucus. But again, the Congressional Black Caucus of the 70s, they're coming deliberately out of the civil rights movement. So I think there's this very conscious conception that we need to continue the legacy of civil rights. We're going to be the people handling the Black stuff in Congress.
The Black, we're going to make sure this Black stuff gets done.
And again.